Smoppy for life. Yeah. Smoppy for life. Stand up when the chief is here. Hands up. Yeah, the chief is here. Stand up when the chief is here. Hands up. Yeah, the chief is here. Yeah. Smoppy for life.
Good afternoon, everybody. And I know you're looking at the two backdrops that you're seeing. The one is real, but really real, and that's Johan's, and the other is real, but it's actually a virtual background. Johan Norberg, thank you so much for joining us on our webinar. You've got a lot of characters here, invitation only, from mainly South Africa, but England, America, and all over the place. And what I'm trying to do, because I'm extremely well educated, highly intelligent, I've read every book imaginable, just kidding, is open people's minds to libertarian thinking, to free market thinking. And everybody in their lives takes freedom for granted. We take capitalism somewhat for granted. We take democracy somewhat for granted. But it's quite extraordinary. We shouldn't, should we? They've always been the exception, and they are increasingly under pressure. And I know you've got your mute on, so I'm going to let you turn that off. But Johan, welcome so much to to being on air with me. I'd love to do an introduction for you, but your bio is so unbelievable. Why don't you just give us the quick précis?
Well, thanks for the invitation, Rob, and thanks for those kind words. I'm happy to have such a distinguished audience, whom I've heard a lot about as well. Well, I'm a Swedish historian of ideas, and this is the real background. This is the Swedish West Coast. We're actually close to the Norwegian border over there, and this is where we spend our summertime back here. I have a background in the intellectual history, the history of ideas, which is actually what you do when you can't make up your mind on what you want to do. Because there's a little bit of everything. It's economic history, it's technology, it's science, it's philosophy, and that really enforces the things that I'm doing. Because I'm freelance, freaks. I write articles, I lecture around the world, and I also do documentary films for US public television. And most recently, a book on progress around the world. Progress, 10 Reasons to Look Forward to the Future. Now in its 25th translation since 2 days ago.
Well, I bet you haven't done Afrikaans yet, but that ought to be done at one point. But I know this is we need some good news in South Africa, Johan. So will you give us 10 good reasons to look forward to the future? They may not apply to South Africa, but I'm sure they apply generally.
Yeah, that's the problem. This is my story about progress is a story about global progress, and it's the average story. And that doesn't apply to everybody. It's a great thing that life expectancy has increased from around 30 years, 120 years ago, in the early 20th century, to 72 years globally, but that doesn't give you much comfort if you die young. So, I mean, you have to keep that in mind. It's a global story and it's the average. But if you look at things like that, if you look at global indicators of the human experience when it comes to health, wealth, human opportunities, schooling, life expectancy, we actually just had the best decade ever in human history. Few people think about that, and I think that's because we spend far too much time thinking about politics, and that's enough to make anybody depressed. But if you look at what happens in technological innovation, medical innovation, the economy, in the last 10 years, we just increased life expectancy by 3 years. So for every year that we grow older, each of us only approach death by around 8 months, which should be enough to make anyone happy. We reduced poverty faster than ever before. Even though world population surged during this decade, the number of extremely poor was reduced by roughly 150,000 people every day for 10 years. That's the kind of ongoing, steady progress that keeps on happening as long as we have growth and innovation in our economies.
Now, I should have prepared this, but there was a great Swedish economist who died 3 years ago. You're going to give me his name in a second. Who did that fabulous YouTube TED Talk. He did that fabulous TED Talk. You're going to give me his name, aren't you?
Hans
Where
Rosling.
he did Hans Rosling, and he really did hit the nail on the head. And I always believe that 93.7% of the world are pessimists, and the rest of us are optimists, because you would die of tooth decay 150 years ago. Now, you don't even think twice about going to the dentist. So you think we should be positive. But if we look at capitalism and democracy, and I know you didn't used to be a bit of a lefty, didn't you? Tell us about that. Tell us that. Let's get on to that.
The reason
you were radical left.
The reason why I'm such a hopeless optimist and believer in capitalism is that I used to be a hopeless pessimist. I used to believe in the good old days. I wanted to escape the kind of hectic lifestyle in the modern technological economy with factories polluting the planet. And I always assumed then that the good old days must have been sort of my ancestors in Northern Europe who lived with subsistence agriculture, a good, happy life. And until I began to study history and studying my grandparents and grandparents' history, and I realized that, well, they didn't live ecologically, they died ecologically. They led short lives with little education, little wealth, few human opportunities. They did the same things that they had learned from their parents, which they had learned from their parents, and they never saw anything else, and children often died young. And that forced me to abandon this belief that we should go back in time to something more romantic, because it really wasn't.
You know, it's interesting you say that. In this, J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings, which I think is one of the most published books in human history. And he did grow up, wasn't born in South Africa, but he grew up, I think, his first 7 or 8 years in South Africa. And most people don't know that, but I'm telling you it's true. But he was anti-industrialization. And and he was also terrified of communism and the rise of the East. So Mordor is in the East, the story is very relevant to today. These big monolithic sort of communist, socialist regimes are Mordor. And we are the good guys, the libertarians, the free thinkers, the rugged individuals.
Yeah.
Let's talk quickly about libertarianism. You're a libertarian, but not an anarchist libertarian, but a classical libertarian.
That's right. I usually call myself a liberal in the classical sense, the John Locke, the Adam Smith version. But that really creates more confusion nowadays, because it means different things in different countries. But yes, that tradition is now mostly called libertarian, because simply I believe in the kind of rules that I learned in kindergarten. Sort of don't steal other kids' stuff, and don't punch them in their faces. But besides that, you can do whatever you like. And that kind of basic civilizationary message is something I still believe in. And that's really the role of government, I think, to make sure that we don't take one another's stuff and kill and hurt others. But besides that, we should be free to go about our businesses.
And, one of my understandings of libertarianism is that if you take it right down to its core, government should only provide two things: protection of the individual and their property against other individuals stealing, in other words, the police, and protection of society against external threats, the army. But everything else, the judiciary, roads, could and should be provided by rugged individuals, entrepreneurs, private capital. Obviously, that's not practical in the world today, because lawyers tend to like adding laws rather than taking them away. Is a libertarian economy, is a libertarian political system achievable in any form in the world?
Oh, I think so. And I think the interesting thing is that if you pull the pieces together from different parts of the world, from various countries where they've experimented with private providers of various services, individual freedom in choosing whatever you like, and competition between those providers. You can see that, and if you combine that, for example, in many countries, you'd say that the government has to provide the schools. Well, in Sweden, we have the school voucher system so that private schools get the same kind of funding. In certain places, you have a social security system, a pension system that is mostly outside of the public coffers. You have a healthcare system that could function like that as well. If you combine those places where it works, and it often works better than in places where it's nationalized, you can see that you create almost a perfect libertarian ideal country like that. It's only that we haven't pulled them together in an individual, in a single country, but I certainly think we can. And the thing is that my basic libertarian principle is based on one simple assumption, and that is that more people are smarter than fewer people, because the chance is greater. With more eyeballs looking at our problems, the chance is greater that we'll come up with a great invention there, a smarter business model over there, and then we can imitate that and we can make sure that that happens. But that's all dependent on freedom for people to come up with new ideas, and for freedom for people to use those ideas. And whenever we have one single government solution to a problem, the only thing that we do is that we take away all that local knowledge and individual knowledge that exists in society and replaces it with just a tiny group of people, a few politicians and bureaucrats or authoritarians, and they make the decision. And that can never be, they might stumble onto something great, but the chance is always bigger that that'll happen if more people are involved.
You know, what you said, I don't know, maybe you've done it in one of your books, but it would be such a good experiment to do, is to take the best from different countries, like the voucher system from Sweden and the healthcare system where pure private provision, and do a map of the best from each country into this hypothetical country. And there are people, there's President Paul Kagame of Rwanda, who I think is who I know is a libertarian, who might actually adopt a number of those. Rwanda could be actually the first country to implement Johan's libertarian map, let's call it.
Look, you're a hopeless optimist as well.
I am. So where is the world today? I mean, we look at America and they're sort of melting down, lunatics running around Portland, leftists, anarchists, defunding the police. I mean, it's completely insane, in my view, entirely. And that's America, which is supposed to be leading the free world. And then you have, China imposing its power. Russia's still as mad as ever. And we've got, it seems to be a lot of bad stuff in the world. If you look back a year or two ago, I mean, Trump was ranting and raving, but if you look back a couple of years ago, we were in quite good shape. Today, I'm feeling pretty negative about things. Should I be? Or is this just a shaking the tree?
Well, we've been here before.
Have we?
If you think that the US is in a particularly problematic position right now, compare it to the 1960s and the 1970s, yes, and the violent protests and the riots roaming through various cities, and often racial riots and terrorist bombings, an everyday occurrence, basically, and the polarization between groups and political assassinations. The Kennedy brothers and Martin Luther King and so on. And everybody said, we will never get back from this. And
Cuba, missile crisis. I mean,
quite right. And then I agree, both China and Russia, they are very problematic, and they're not just hurting their own countries with that kind of authoritarian regimes, but also trying actively to undermine free societies in other places. But, that was a large part of the Soviet Union's GDP was going to undermining our societies. And threatening us with instant nuclear annihilation constantly. So we have those occurrences on a regular basis, I would say, and we always pull through as long as the people who are, I was almost gonna say the silent majority, but that it brings forth sort of Richard Nixon to the fore. So I
like
should
this.
use another.
You mean like this?
Yeah, it's not really the silent majority, but most people, the reason why politics is so messed up is that we've left it to the weirdos on all sides. And most people just want to go about their business, and they are fed up with politics, and they're almost rationally ignorant of what is going on in politics because they have jobs, they've got stuff to do. So, but I think whenever we approach some sort of cliff, I think that sort of the broad majority of moderate, rational people, they often pull through.
So I often say to my beloved New Zealand doctor wife, whose 3 sisters have all married lawyers, and her father's a lawyer. And I always say that politicians, bureaucrats, regulators, and lawyers are inherently evil because they want to opine. They're not the man in the arena, Teddy Roosevelt's beautiful speech. They're sitting in the audience wanting to impose their thinking upon us. So is the sort of interim opportunity, devolution of power, sort of pushing power down to state, federal level, ultimately down to the individual? Is that
I think that that's a safety valve. That's one of the reasons why I always believe in America, no matter how messed up it seems to be. Because if Sweden gets the wrong government with a majority in parliament, they can make terrible mistakes and do awful things because there's not much of checks and balances, not much of a division of powers, and there's not much of federalism in that sense. Whereas in the US, often the good things happen locally and on the state level, and you also have an institutional competition, so that when you messed up regulations and taxes in certain places, others don't. And sooner or later, facts tend to kick and influence people, and we begin to imitate those who do better. And so I think generally pushing power to the state level and then to city level and then to down to families and individuals, it's not just a better way because we have more knowledge that is being used, more experiments being done that we can learn from, but also because we minimize the risk of some.
Hans Otterling, who's Swedish, he's one of my very best friends. He's one of the principals of North Zone. North Zone, as you know, is the most successful venture tech investor outside of Silicon Valley, and it comes from Scandinavia. It's London, Stockholm. And Hans always tells the story, which is a story of faith in Cape Town. He tells a story of Stockholm when you had a 100% tax rate in Sweden. Yeah. When was that? That was.
Yeah, in the 1970s. So if you made mistakes like working hard and taking risks, that could happen.
They took everything away. So you had a 100% tax rate or high tax rates. Sweden was the dead end of Europe. No one wanted to go there. And overnight, your government said, this isn't working. Let's let the currency run. Let's lift the pot. Let's let entrepreneurs come in. Let's let people get on with doing what they're best at. And Sweden took off as a result. So I think your country has managed to balance things along the way. Our country, South Africa, we've got a disaster in the ANC running the country. I mean, they're kleptocrats, ineptocrats, and they're going to destroy this country. But you then look at Germany after the Second World War, destroyed. Look at it now. Unbelievable economy. You look at communist California today, everyone's escaping to Republican Texas. It'll probably destroy Texas. I hope not. So there is hope, isn't there? I mean, but the problem is timing. I'm 60 years old, so I want to be able to work for another 20 years, but not in a socialist country. Do you think give us the countries that you look you look at and go, wow, if I was younger, I'd go there. That's a country on the move.
Well, first of all, I think you're right that often, the prospect of being hanged in the morning concentrates the mind beautifully, as Samuel Johnson put it. And I think that goes for many economies. The moment that disaster strikes, you sort of pull back from the brink. That's really what happened in Sweden. Our socialist experiment in the 1970s and 1980s, it almost destroyed us. The bizarre thing is that many socialists around the world, they still remember this fondly, this period, because this was the moment in time when Sweden experimented with socialism, and it seemed like we were doing okay. We weren't sort of a poor, starving country, but it's like that old joke: how do you end up with a small fortune? Well, you start with a large fortune, and then you waste most of it, because this was really our Atlas Shrugged moment, when all the important companies like IKEA, Tetra Pak, they left. Our famous playwrights like Ingmar Bergman left Sweden. Our sports stars, Bjorn Borg and others,
went to Monaco.
Sweden.
Yep.
And we didn't create a single net job in the economy for 25 years. And at that point, a person said that these policies that we've dealt with, they were perverse, unsustainable, and absurd. And that was the Social Democratic Minister of Finance at the time, Kjell-Olof Feldt, who said that. And then Social Democrats and the center-right in combination in Sweden turned things around dramatically in the 1990s, and Sweden began to outperform similar countries again. And that story gives me some hope that this can if it can happen in Sweden, it can happen everywhere, anywhere in the world. But yes, it could take time. We might not have time. That's one of the reasons why we have to work hard and fight for our ideas, because it doesn't happen by itself. It depends on the ideas that happen to lie around at the moment of crisis as well. Then people began to look around for other ideas that could help us through. And then those ideas that seem so controversial and problematic just months earlier can suddenly come to the fore.
So can we talk about technology? I mean, somebody said, I can't remember who it was beautiful. I'm going to get this wrong. It says we have this sort of sex drive of the cavemen, the regulations of the medieval years, but the technology from the gods. And how do you combine these things? It's chaos. Surely there's a solution to some of this stuff through technology. I mean, the sort of science fiction Isaac Asimov, that every day you vote on the 2 or 3 key issues, and then you go off and do what you want. So pure democracy. But is there one of your ideas must be a technology solution or not?
I think, wasn't that Wilson who said, the famous Edmund Wilson, is that his name, the social biologist? And he said that he was afraid of that. We have these minds of the Stone Ages, and regulations from the Middle Ages, and technology from the future and from the gods. Basically, I see that as our hope, because I think that technology saves us. Unless it ends up in the wrong hands, obviously they can wreak a lot of havoc as well. But I think that technology is what helps us to bypass those regulations. And what I mean by that is not that I think that we can live in some sort of some sort of techno government, taking care of the issues. We vote on a couple of things and then we go about our business. I've yet to see some version of that really tempts me, because I always think that the bad people will somehow find a way to distort the political process. But I think it helps us to bypass them and find another way. One of the reasons why better ideas were lying around in Sweden in the 1990s was that we had entrepreneurs who found new ways to circumvent the regulations. We had a television monopoly. We only had 2 television stations run by the government. But then John Stenbeck, a famous Swedish entrepreneur.
I met him. I actually met him before he died.
great person,
what a character.
as you can testify, lots of energy, came up with the idea, well, then I can start a TV station in Britain, because
Satellites.
they don't stop me, and we have satellites, and then we can do it. And then he solved the situation, and as he put it, is that interests and sort of the special interests and rent seekers, they find a way to beat the political process, but technology finds a way to beat them. We can then circumvent it. And I think that's what's happening if you look at technology today, things that come from Silicon Valley and sometimes from Nordic
China.
countries as well, and sometimes from China. It's not that the taxi monopoly was broken down because we petitioned the city board, we need more taxi licenses. It was that somebody created an app, and we had the Uberization of the economy, and suddenly that just happens. And they break the regulations, but they do it in a way that creates a new interest in these goods and services, and that creates a new electorate who doesn't want to implement the old regulations, and then things happen. And I hope for a future where we see more innovations like that, because that's the way to beat the old medieval regulations.
So I often joke, people say, sort of, if you had to start your career now, where would you focus your attention? And I always say that, data analytics, artificial intelligence, robotics, it has to be in that area. And that my real dream is to own the world's leading sex robot factory. Because if but my wife always says I'll get jealous and beat up her sex robot, so it's never going to work out. But that's a whole other issue. So people are worried that the robotics and AI world is going to replace jobs, and there's going to be a period of dislocation too large for the social inequality that we have and the world to deal with it. I have a view on it, but I'd love to hear your view first. Do you fear robotics and AI taking people's jobs away, the cleaners and wipers and people that pump gas into cars?
I think the problem might be the opposite, that kind of future doesn't come soon enough. And the reason why I say that is that every time we've had technological innovations that helps us to deal with some of the routine, everyday stuff that we do in our households and in jobs, that makes us more valuable. That makes the human mind more valuable, because it's not that it replaces us, it's that we find a way to make them into a way to make us focus our time in what we are best at. And we said that when the computer came in the early 1980s in Sweden, we had a minister of computers who said that perhaps we should implement a computer tax to slow this whole thing down, because it will replace us all. Well, what we've seen is that, we had lots of dislocation, but the dislocation wasn't that computers replaced human workers. It was that workers with computers replaced workers without computers. And the kind of jobs where we use computers, they grew in value because it makes us more productive. And then you have to find a way to integrate the computer into your line of business as well to become productive.
And I think
I just read this report on 50% of our job be automated. Well, Google just automated 50% of my job, because 50% of my job used to be walking down to the library, looking for that piece of statistics, that quote, and so on. Now Google handles that, and hopefully that makes me productive, because then I focus on trying to make sense of it, analyze it, and having a human-to-human contact instead.
And what has happened in every case where there's been a new massive technology change is people forget of the ancillary businesses. Firstly, the businesses that technology creates, but the ancillary businesses that feed around it. It grows the economy. And in the Industrial Revolution in Britain, what happened was, all of a sudden, people, certain people, had free time. No one had ever had free time before. And they invented rugby, cricket, skiing, and all those sports, which have turned into industries on their own. So I'm so excited about the future. I want to live forever. I'll try my best.
Or die trying.
Or die trying, exactly. Don't let me know. Is there an idea that you're forming that you haven't quite nailed down yet? Is there the new thesis that you're... I mean, I shouldn't really ask you, should you? Because someone else might write the book quickly. What challenge, what are you struggling with? Is there something like that we can try and conceptualize for you?
Well, the one thing that I am struggling with, and this relates to a previous question that you had about our Stone Age brains, and my next book, Open, is dealing with that, but I've yet to solve the problem, and that is that everything that we have and that we love and that we treasure, all the best institutions and the cultural traditions and the technology and the wealth, that's being created by openness to new ideas and strange surprises and weird stuff happening in places that you would never have looked for them. You know how robotics is now being informed by the gaming industry. They solve many of those problems. Many of the online applications that we use in real-time video and online payments came from the porn industry, things like that. Yeah. And that's why we have to be open to crazy things, because that'll help us. The problem is that our Stone Age brains hate that. We want certainty. We want predictability. We don't want weirdos. We want people who live sort of stable, normal lives, just like you and I, and we hate everything else. And especially when we feel threatened, we want to stop that. We want to block it. We want to regulate everything, and we want a strong man in charge taking care of us. And that ruins that whole progress. And that's the basic dilemma that we have yet to deal with unless we come up with some sort of great way of learning from experience or some sort of bioengineering that helps us to grasp it all.
So Hans Otterling, my dear friend that I mentioned, who's living in South Africa, but he's back in Stockholm at the moment, he asks a question. And this might be a tricky one for you, because it says Cyril Ramaphosa, who's our president, is handcuffed by the unions, by minority groups, by patronage, by favors that he owes people. And as a result, people are calling him spineless, because we were hoping that he could rescue our country from the evils of the Zuma and Gupta regime, where they stole everything and broke everything. But Cyril's done almost nothing. And Hans's question is, what have other leaders done in the past, being in that sort of position to regain executive power? It's quite a tough question, because you don't know the context as well as you could, but I mean.
Well, I know there's been, I've read about the hopes that people had about Ramaphosa, that he would really clean up the kind of crony government that's been in place for such a long time. It's often phrased as sort of, it's hopeless because he leads an organization that thrives upon this, and many powerful individuals who do. But that's really also why he could do things about it. It's the old Nixon could go to China, because he had those groups who he was reliable, because he came from a communist eating background. And that, I think, is what Ramaphosa could do as well. What many leaders have done, who've gone down in history as great reformers, is that they have challenged their own movements and challenged their own interests by sort of breaking up some of the assumptions and the kind of government that they led, by posing a greater future, by talking about how this really, in the same way that he's handcuffed by his interests, well, those interests handcuff the entire economy and the entire government. It is possible to talk about a potential future for the country, for the economy, but it takes some sacrifices back home in those movements. And that's what Swedish Social Democrats did in the 1990s. The trade unions hated many of the reforms that were being done, but by showing that, look, our future also depends on a thriving economy. If you want the spoils of the hunt, we have to sort of unleash some of that entrepreneurial energy as well. That's what happened in many of the countries that made great reforms, like New Zealand and Australia as well, often being done by the particular individuals and politicians who came from a background of trade unions, of social democracy. They did it. But the problem is that it also takes some spine to do it, because you risk everything by doing it.
You know, in Sweden, you at least have unions that you could sit and talk to on a sensible basis and say, look, here, the economy is in real trouble, and you, et cetera, et cetera. Margaret Thatcher had to take on a violent union and stand up to them and break them. But we have the unions sitting at the table next to Cyril Ramaphosa. He was a union leader, and he is unable to change their views. It's unions, communists, and the people he's done these sneaky deals with who are holding the sword of Damocles above his head. My worry is that the only way to break the ANC and have the country end up with a government it really needs is economic crisis, and we're heading rapidly towards that. Plus, in a mafia patronage organization, you know, people want to get paid to do what they're told to do. If they run out of money and don't pay them, those people either move to the other side, become whistleblowers, turn on their masters, and I reckon that the money's running out for them to bribe. They can't steal anymore, nothing left to steal, and they're going to have a hard time bribing anyone. So the danger is it goes the other way, and we end up with, you know, Lenin, Trotsky, and there's an awful person in this country who runs a thing called the EFF. I don't even want to say his name. So we're heading towards a crisis, no question, and it's coming quite soon. So keep an eye on us, Johan. We may need your help. All right, so that's one idea that you're dealing with. Tell us what else is challenging you, or something that you think might happen that, you know, the savior, the messiah, the technology breakthrough that will make everyone happy. Is there such a thing?
No, I don't think we should wait for messiahs. That's not really how to go about things. My idea about, even though I as many of the examples that I've talked about, Sweden and hopefully if it turns out well in South Africa, there's a crisis that challenges old assumptions, and it's impossible to sustain the old model, and then you have to look for something else. But my basic take on change and improvement is more like that great philosopher Leonard Cohen put it, there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. More how you look for change from not from the politicians, not from the saviors, not from the messiahs, but from the new businesses, the new innovators who come up with ways of using that small openings that always exist in every regulatory system, and then make it sustainable for long enough time so that people can see the value and the benefit of it, and that changes things. You know, the postal system in the US wasn't reformed because anybody wanted to reform the US post office. Nobody did. They still haven't done it. But Fred Smith came up with the idea that, look, there's an opening for extremely urgent messages. Then it's okay for a private provider to do it. And that's why he created FedEx, and on every message, every letter, every box, it said extremely urgent. So my books were extremely urgent, and then he could do it, and he could do it for a long enough time so that people realized that, wow, this is great. Why do we have this monopoly? And then it became a part of our everyday lives. And I think that's what we should be looking for, not the messiahs, but the small cracks and how we can exploit them.
It's lovely you say that, because a great friend of mine, Professor Carlos Lopez, who he's probably one of the most magical economists that ever come out of Africa. And he can talk for hours and hours. If you ask him, you know, the one thing he'd like to see, he goes, it's just the incremental change every day, just a little improvement on a little improvement. And it's lovely to think that makes the difference. The chink, the light comes in, or, I love that thought. I love that thought.
And you know
So
what revolutionizes our life is human wealth, because economic growth makes everything possible. It's just, we call it economic growth, but it's really the fact that we can do more things tomorrow than we could today. And 1% growth per capita, then we double everything that we can do in 70 or so years. But if we can increase it to 2% per capita, we can do it in 35 years. We double everything. And that changes everything. It doesn't sound that dramatic or romantic. Economic growth, we've got this great big movement saying we should have degrowth, and it's really lowered. But it's really those small changes improves everything.
I think if you go back for 8 years of speeches that the leaders of the ANC have made, I doubt they've ever used the two words economic growth. I just think that's not what they look at. They look at taking things away and feeding themselves, but not growing our economy. It's depressing. But we've got an interesting question here, and I wish I knew who guest 6266 is. Could it be Yao Pepro? Yao, is it you? Admit it. How important is the outcome of the US election in terms of defining what society looks like and thinks like in the years to come? Is this the most important election in our lifetime, or is it overhyped?
Everything is overhyped because we happen to live through it. And to us, the outcome is unclear, and we don't know the consequences of it. And that's always scary. That's the reason why we always think that it must have been some good old days back in the past when we didn't live through turbulent times, because we know that they survived it and went through with it. But every generation has experienced that the future is unpredictable, and therefore we don't know. So it's overhyped. That's not really where the action is. And I think that if we really want to know the future of the US, it's more on state level. It's what happens in the incremental changes that are happening. But with that being said, I think there is something about our world order that is being where I would like to see something. Being an old anarchist, I would like to see more of a return to normal. Because there are so many things with the Democratic Party that I dislike when it comes to regulation, when it comes to taxes, when it comes to their view of new technologies and so on. But there's something about Donald Trump's and his version of the Republican Party's interest in throwing wrenches into the machinery of trade and international cooperation, which is really harming us all. And I think making many countries, democratic capitalist countries around the world, looking for new friends and thinking that the US is a very unreliable ally, which is very problematic and gives an advantage to China, Russia, and countries like that. And I would really love to see a boring, sort of stumbling,
grumpy old
Biden administration
grumpy young,
for 4 years, and then a rejuvenation of the Republican Party back to some sort of normalcy.
Interesting that you say that, because I do think 4 years of Biden would calm things down. I'm not a big fan of his, but I think it would calm things down and would allow the Republican Party to regenerate as a libertarian, capitalist, free market, global player. But let's talk quickly about globalization, because that's an important thrust in your thinking. You're a big believer, aren't you, in globalization and international free trade?
Yes, and that's really just another implementation of my basic perspective that the more people who think, the better off we are. And globalization is really the same thing, being able to make use of the ideas, the work, the production, the skills, the experiments taking place in other places. Because we might be the smartest people in the room, but face it, every room is pretty small. And everything we do depend on the insights, the inputs, the crazy ideas and the goods and services coming from other places. And the more people who are, some people think of globalization as some sort of, it's this warm, fuzzy kind of openness to everybody, no matter how they are. It's not at all about that. It's about self-interest. Do you want to limit yourself to what happens around here? Well, in that case, I'd be pretty much worse off. The more people's ideas and weird ideas that I can make use of, the better off I am. And then everything else, investments, free trade, that's just a particular version of that openness. But it's really about that. Do I want to be smarter or not?
And the other positive about globalization and free trade is you lower barriers. You have to work closer with the bad guys at the moment, the Chinese or the North Koreans. I worked for Rupert Murdoch just before the Berlin Wall came down and afterwards. And he was making speeches saying, the Berlin Wall can't survive because, East Germany they want their MTV, basically. CDs were flowing across the board. They were seeing what was going on in the West. There was no way you could hold them back. And the more we trade with the bad guys, the more they realize we have a lot of benefits in free market. A question I'm dying to ask you about capitalism. There's pure capitalism, let's just call it that, and socialism in its evil form. And a lot of people are saying, wow, the way forward is capitalist with a socialist heart. There's this kind of blend. But what's your view on that? Yeah. Could you have elements of a capitalist society that are socialized and have it work better than pure capitalism? If I'm making any sense.
Well, I don't think so, because it makes a lot of sense. But you have to distinguish between two different things, and that's whether you socialize production and businesses or you socialize consumption and income through high taxes. That's the first thing. I remember the anecdote about how France's socialist president Francois Mitterrand came to France, and he saw that, oh, look, this is interesting because back home we socialized businesses and it all collapsed. But you seem to socialize human beings. That's much better. And he had a bit of a point because every time you socialize businesses, well, the result is that the only thing that happens is that you lose the innovation that has to happen in any kind of business that's exposed to innovation. The only thing you do when you socialize it is that you protect it somehow from that competitive pressure, and that always ends up in failure, because if you are in charge and you don't have to face competitors, or if you know that you've got this sort of the finance ministry is sending you gifts when you fail, then you will fail. But what Sweden did was socialize through high taxes, and that's often what people talk about. Socialize some services like schooling, healthcare, and so on. Yeah. But and I think that it's easier to do that than socialize businesses, because then you can create lots of wealth in the competitive sector, in private businesses, and then you can socialize and redistribute some of it. But what Sweden learned is that you have the same problem coming back through the back door. First of all, the high taxes will ruin some of that private sector. In the end, you won't get the resources that you need for those services. The other thing is that you lose that competitive pressure that you also need in schooling and in healthcare to keep those sectors innovating, making sure that they don't waste resources, but pay attention to the needs of the pupils and to the patients. And that's why we began to open up those sectors with the school voucher system, private providers in healthcare, and we're struggling with that to get back to some of that openness. So that's why I think that you need to at least imitate pure capitalism, even in those socialist sectors, to make it work at least half decently.
So your book that you've already on the shelves, which we're all going to buy, gives us the 10 reasons to feel good about the future. Your new book, which is coming out in 2 weeks, Open, tells us what?
Open tells us the reason why we have this progress, and it's really a historical excursion into, well, basically all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia and back to our time, showing that it's only in the cracks that we see the light come in and the innovations happening. Why it comes from the surprises, the eccentrics, the entrepreneurs, the innovators, often those who are we frown upon, we dislike them. They are the crazy people who create all those great things that we now treasure and love. But it's also an attempt to understand why we constantly have these backlashes against it. Why, whenever we, you satisfy your thirst, you turn your back to the well, and you forget that you need all those crazy entrepreneurs and innovators to create all this wealth, and you begin to redistribute, you begin to centralize, regulate, and destroy this. And that, I think, is our struggle with our Stone Age brain, which is great. I love my Stone Age brain because it got us this far, and it turned us into traders, into cooperators, so that we can cooperate with strangers and suddenly sort of come up with these competitive and comparative advantages, so that I do something, you do something else, and we can exchange much more in the long run. The problem is that we often came up with this evolutionary advantage in a particular setting. We came up with this ability to cooperate to kill the other guys.
Right. Or in a crisis.
Yes, and we have this tendency always in a time of crisis to get back to that, to circle the wagons, to look to the strong man, to point us in the right direction. And that worked out splendidly in a Stone Age setting when the opponent was sort of the other tribe wanting to kill us.
Or one dinosaur.
then it made perfect evolutionary sense, and it helped us to beat the other tribe. The problem is that today the threat is something else. It is low growth, or it's a pandemic, or it's something complex in a complex society, in a complex economy. And therefore, we need to not to circle the wagons, not to activate our fight or flight instinct. It is to find better ways to cooperate with that great scientist in China who might come up with a vaccine, or that wonderful person working in the robot sector in a Polish basement. So we have to keep ourselves and our minds
interconnected,
and our economies open and interconnected, especially in times of crisis. And to do that, we have to count to 10, because we always fear the outside and that openness in times of trouble. And that, I try to explain that in the book and how to deal with it.
It's going to be a great book. It is going to be a great book. So Johan, just to wrap up, let's hear a little bit about Johan the man. You're married, children, champion golfer. Tell us. Swedes are good at sports. So.
Yes, I'm married. 3 kids, 1 bonus son, since this is my second marriage, and 1 cat, a Cornish Rex, that keeps us company all the time.
What's his name?
The cat's name is Sansa. And
what does that mean? Sansa.
That's actually from Game of Thrones. Sansa is the queen of the
North.
North.
Yes, it is. And by the way, I'm Mance Raider.
That makes perfect sense.
I'm up north. I'm pulling together the giants and the wildlings, the guy with the big red beard. I'm pulling everyone together.
And climbing the wall to save us all.
To save, exactly. While everyone's fighting. I'm going to try and, that's my job. So Sansa the cat. And do you have a hobby, a mad hobby that we want to hear about?
Yeah, I'm not a golfer. I'm a tennis player. So my father, who's actually over here, he had amazing patience with me when I was young, and sort of I couldn't even sort of hold the tennis racket. But he went through all these years, and then eventually I learned it, and trying to learn my kids the same thing right now, because that's the great thing. If you've got that technique, then you can do it forever, it seems like. So that's what I do. And then, yeah, sorry.
And what books do you have next to your bed? What are you reading of other authors?
Actually, right now, during summertime, I try to spend lot of time with fiction, because I think it's such a great way to learn about other human experiences without having to meet all these people.
Good point. Good point. That's lovely.
But
So you're reading
but
fiction.
also, yeah, I have to pitch another book as well. And it's actually a book, and I forgot the name of the author, and the title of the book as well.
That's okay.
But it's actually,
is it a fiction? It's fiction.
No. This is nonfiction, and the great thing about it is that it looks through all these data, this science about, you know, the new narrative about how easily deceived we are by cognitive biases, and especially all the algorithms and how they point us in a certain direction, and then we suddenly believe in this candidate and all these conspiracy theories. It's not that simple. We're not that easily deceived.
I agree.
It's a counterintuitive take on that data, and I love that book. I only wish I could remember it.
Well, when you do, just pop it on an email and I'll add it to the bot, by the way.
Yeah.
Because you and I are processing so much data, it's impossible to remember everything. That's the excuse I use. And do you have, the final question is, Johan, do you have a mantra or a saying that you love, that you sort of pass to your children? And I always quote this one. I should do a different one, but my great Irish friend, Dermot Desmond, he has hundreds. He says, life is a mystery to be lived, not a problem to be solved. And I love it because it just puts everything into this rhythm that I love. But there are many more. Do you have one, or is there one in particular that you want to give to me, and I'll let everyone else use it?
That's a great one. That will be my new favorite.
I'll send it to you.
I'll steal that.
Yeah.
But no, the one I live by, and which really comforts me when the process on the road is very long to get somewhere and to achieve something and save civilization and so on, is really my take on Aristotle, which is my favorite philosopher in so many ways. And it's really, in a way, Aristotle knew and improved, but his perspective on the human experience is that happiness is not a destination, but it's really a way of travel, and that I think is important to us as individuals and economies and as civilizations. Because if you imagine it as some sort of end point, some sort of utopia, it leads the mind wrong, and you'll always be disappointed. Try to think of it as well, instead of as Aristotle would say today, as it's a computer game, it's a video game. We level up to the next level, and then we'll face new fierce enemies trying to kill us off, and new things that have to be gathered and problems to be solved. And then hopefully we can level up again and again and again. But we'll never reach utopia, because utopia would be too boring. We don't want to be there. We want to sort of use all our potentials, all our tools, and our human capabilities constantly. Yeah. That's happiness.
Well, this has been a very happy 45 minutes to an hour with you. I must say, I love it. I'd like to go on for hours, but let's try and do that in person. You've got an invitation to come to Cape Town anytime you want, and we will look after you. And I want to thank our mutual friend, Carl Frederick Sammerly, who is a fantastic guy. He's got this project called BitProp in the townships in South Africa, where he's building houses and allowing the person that owns that small piece of land to rent it out and own the house over time. So, I mean, these are good stories. These are reasons to be positive about the future.
And Johan, what a Frederick is involved with. That's really sort of the light getting through the cracks.
Yeah.
The kind of incremental change that really changes human beings, their perspective, and in the long run, the whole society. So it's such a great thing, and Carl Frederick is such a great guy. And so are you, Rob. Thank you so much.
And so are you.
It's a very nice conversation.
What a treat. Yeah, love to stay in touch with you, and thank you so much. And congratulations. Fly the flag.
Thank you.
Cheers, Johan.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Bye.